I asked Dr. Tsipursky to come today, and I told him this too. And I'm gonna. Since this is such a trusted group, I can do this introduction in this way, Doctor. So thank you for allowing me a little bit of flexibility. Because normally I'd build you up and everything else, but this is going to build you up. Another contributor said, "Hey, I just talked to this person. I've known him for a while, and I really think you should talk to him." And I'm thinking, "Oh yeah, right, sure. Another. Here comes another one. Somebody that wants to teach me about COVID. Someone wants to teach me about this." And so I took it to the team because on my podcast, for those of you who don't know, unless you're one of you, okay, or you have at least 100,000 followers or of a major brand, you're not getting on my show. That's it. You don't get on my show. And of course, now I'm going for the head of SHRM. I've got the head of the SBA coming on. I'm about to do the head of the meeting industry, the association executive. I'm doing them all, getting them all. So very high level. And so I said, no. And then be honest with you, somebody canceled, and they had to talk about being in the right time at the right place at the right time was Dr. Tsipursky. So they said, well, he's on the show. And so I show up and, here he is. He's going to be on the show. So I get to read his bio and go, oh, this is better than I expected. But minutes into the conversation of the interview, I said, oh my God, I got to have him talk to the Thought Council. I mean, while he was talking, I'm writing email going, get him on and talk to the Thought Council. And you're going to find out why. Because he talks about the neuroscience of how we do what we do and why we do what we do. And what was unique for me was to hear him talk about what we're going through in COVID and then how that applies to the way we're starting to communicate, why we rushed off to buy toilet paper. But beyond that, I was wanting him to talk more about how we start making the adjustments that we have to do and how we should be thinking of it and how others think of it because of neuroscience, of how we communicate, we do our presentations. How do I get introverts to become extroverts or more extroverted if I want, or, how I try to deal with it. Because when you're doing these presentations like this, listen, and by the way, continue to eat. Continue to do what you're going to do, right? But yeah. As a presenter, you're looking at that going, hey, what the fuck? If you're doing a big stand-up presentation, or yesterday or the day before, I'm watching as people had their feet up on the desk, as people were in their pajamas, whatever, and I'm going, oh my God. And all this is going through your head, so you have to deal with this stuff and why we deal with it, why we think like that. And so I couldn't think of a better person to present to us today and spend the next 40, 45 minutes with us, just absorbing how you need to prepare and how you need to be thinking. And you're going to get a PhD, or at least someone with a PhD, to be able to give this information to us. So I'm going to turn it over to the good doctor. And if you got questions, throw them in the side, but let's pay attention. Let's give them a big round. Let's give them a good clapping. This is our clapping, Gleb. So, I'll turn it over to you, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That's a very kind introduction. I really appreciate that. And in this context, I know that is really an important, uplifting message to hear. I like the narrative from, whatever this guy, and like, oh, actually this guy has something useful to say. So let's see if I do have something useful to say. I'll look forward to hearing your feedback after the presentation. So let's talk about how you can help as a trusted advisor. You all on the Thought Council are trusted advisors. You're providing your advice to leaders, executives of various sorts. So you need to be trusted advisors, and you need to help them adapt effectively to COVID-19, adapt and plan for the future. And for that, you need to understand yourself what's going on with COVID-19 and why we, first of all, greatly underestimated the threat of COVID-19. So let's talk about that. Starting with Elon Musk. One of the most prominent entrepreneurs in the world, if not the most prominent, at least because of his megaphone. So he's certainly not the richest, but he's very, very prominent. His Twitter following is huge. And as you can see, on March 6, 2020, he tweeted that the coronavirus panic is dumb. And that got 344,000 retweets and 1.7 million likes. A lot of people paid attention to him. Some people maybe in the Thought Council, elsewhere, pay attention to him a lot. And that's what he said, and people paid attention. And then on March 20th, now remember, March 16th was the declaration by Donald Trump that, hey, this is a really serious situation, we need social distancing. And Elon Musk tweeted that based on current trends, probably close to 0 cases in the US in April. As you can see from the current evidence, there's no 0 new cases in April. There will definitely be a trajectory going up of new cases, and this is a big problem. So people like Elon Musk greatly underestimate it and the pandemic, and you're advising a lot of these people. But this is not only kind of Elon Musk entrepreneurs. This is the most prominent financial advisors, analysts out there. Let's talk about Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs, big, huge name. It estimated US GDP growth in second quarter on February 24th. So when Italy was getting into quarantine, on 2.7% growth in US GDP. Then, just about 3 weeks later, on March 15th, it said 5% decline. Imagine that. For its analysts, it was giving the best advice to its investors, its clients, and it was wrong by 7% of US GDP, over 7% GDP. Wrong, bad. So made this adjustment. But then what happened 5 days later? Well, guess what? March 20th, 24% decline. It went from a 5% decline to 24% decline. And this is Goldman Sachs we're talking about. They, if they don't have the resources to predict what good decision making about the coronavirus is, who does, right? Well, this has to do with how most people were unprepared. They either listened to old money, trusted advice like Goldman Sachs, or the new entrepreneurs like Elon Musk. And as a result, the vast majority of leaders were underprepared, greatly underprepared, underestimated the threat. They were caught really with their pants down by the pandemic, and they turned to their emergency business continuity plans. But these plans are a bad fit for the situation. Now, my expertise is in disaster avoidance. I'll talk about that later. So I help people make a number of disaster preparedness, business continuity plans, but they are not meant for this sort of situation. They are meant for emergencies. That's what they're meant for. And COVID-19, it's not an emergency. It's a major disruptor. It's slow-moving, high-impact, long-term. So compare it to, let's say, Houston being flooded. Houston being flooded, probably everyone knows that. A couple of summers ago, huge major floods in Houston. And what happened was that the city was very quickly flooded for about a week. And that's what business continuity plans are great for. Major disruptor, lasts about a week, maybe 2 weeks, suddenly comes on. COVID-19 was not like that. It's a gradual, slow-moving threat. It's a high-impact one, major impact, not simply on Houston. And it's long-term. We'll talk about the long-term in a bit. So that's not what business continuity plans are meant for. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So businesses that turn to their business continuity plans were kind of not in the right place, and they keep going in emergency mode, they're going to burn out. This is bad. So relying on business continuity plans is a serious problem. Now, facts about COVID-19, just going through it quickly, probably most of you know about this, it's super highly contagious. If you don't suppress it, and in fact, every infected person infects 2 to 3 others, and an outbreak in any area, if Joe goes into a new city and he has COVID-19, then the outbreak doubles every 3 to 6 days, and that gets pretty large pretty quickly without any suppression measures. There's a serious risk of a bad illness. 10 to 20% get seriously ill, and half of the seriously ill need hospitalization. Now, I know that personally from my family. My dad lives in New York City. He is 79, and he got COVID-19 pretty certain because we couldn't have a test because of the limited amount of testing, but he had lots of difficulty breathing, loss of taste, smell, which is associated with COVID-19. My mom, fortunately, she's a medical doctor, so she was able to take care of him at home. Otherwise, he would have needed to go into a hospital. And he kind of he was hanging on the edge of going to the hospital, not going to the hospital. She eventually was able to keep him away from the hospital, and he's slowly on the recovery track. He's not there yet. But he's one of those people who likely would have been hospitalized, and given the current conditions in New York City hospitals, that would not have been great. So I'm very thankful for my mom being a medical doctor and being able to take care of him. Fortunately, it doesn't look like she caught it from him, but so I know it from my family. Anyway, facts. It's much more deadly than the flu. 0.5% to 1% die. So that's the approximate number that die, 0.5% on the low end, 1% on the high end of various estimates. That's a much higher death rate for people like my dad who are over 60, or those younger with underlying health conditions. You might have heard about a baby that recently died, not a baby, a toddler, like a 5-year-old that died, and the firefighter and cop's daughter. It's in the news recently. So lots of people with underlying health conditions who are younger die. There's no effective treatment. We don't have any effective treatment. There are lots of hyped up treatments. They are not effective. We don't have any effective treatment, unfortunately, against COVID-19. So our best hope is a vaccine. That is what we are really looking for. That's the goal, that's the hope, and it's the only effective solution. Human trials for a vaccine, any vaccine that we can create, we'll need to test the safety and the effectiveness of vaccine. That takes a while. No matter how much money you throw at it, it takes a long time to test the safety and effectiveness of vaccine. Usually, vaccines take 4 to 5 years. And this one is estimated to take at least a year plus. Even if you throw all the money at it, that's how long a vaccine trial takes. So, given that most vaccines don't make it through trials, it's just the reality of the situation. It's likely that the first batch that's been rushed into production of vaccine, we have a vaccine trial going on since mid-March, and there's more coming into trials. But they are kind of rushed into production, so likely they will not go through. So this is something that you need to realize. Then the government would need to coordinate, after the vaccine is ready, the mass production, huge numbers of vaccine, at least 150 million doses to vaccinate the people in the US who are vulnerable, whether it's older people or those with underlying health conditions, people over 60 and underlying health conditions. Then the distribution of it everywhere, and then the vaccination of it. Now, how confident are you about the competence of the US government? Well, given that it wasn't very competent in the early stages of pandemic response, whereas many other governments, like the German government, were much more competent, I'm not very confident that it will be doing a good job in vaccine production distribution, and neither should you. So, possible timelines. We have an optimistic one, we have a moderate one that's kind of more realistic, and we have a pessimistic one. The super optimistic timeline, approved for mass production by summer 2021, that assumes that one of the first vaccines that goes into trial, we're super lucky and it's successful. Then production, distribution, vaccination, the government proves exceedingly surprisingly competent. It takes only 6 months. So most people will be vaccinated by early 2022, and we can get out of this terrible, terrible situation, economic hurt, health hurt, by early 2022. That is the most optimistic timeline. That is super optimistic. You should not expect that it will happen. I would estimate less than 5% probability for this. So there's a moderate timeline. Now, moderate timeline, that's more realistic. It's approved for mass production by 2023, assumes that the first wave or 2 waves of vaccines will not be successful, maybe the third wave will be. And that production, distribution, vaccination, government is moderately competent, so assume about a year. Then most people will be vaccinated by 2024. So that's what you should be expecting most likely will happen. I'd say there is a 70% probability that this will be the case. So somewhere between late 2022 and late 2026 with a midpoint of 2024. Now, pessimistic timeline. This is bad. It's approved for mass production by 2026, so it assumes that it's more difficult than we expect to produce the vaccine. So it takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of time to produce a vaccine, and then production, distribution, vaccination, 1 year. Then most people will be vaccinated by 2027. That's a pessimistic timeline. So I'd say there's about a 25% of that. Now, you might think, that I'm being too cynical about this and so on. Well, you might know that we don't have an effective vaccine against the flu yet. Our only vaccine against the flu is 50% effective. So this is not something that is out of the imaginable actually by 2027, maybe even later. But that is something that you need to realize is that 25% bottom case that can very well happen. So this is what you're facing. This is what we are all facing. And we need to address this. The only way to address this in the meantime is through suppression, because we're not an authoritarian society, so we're not going to put chains on people who are and make them on the doors of people to make them isolate themselves, as happened in Wuhan. So we're not an authoritarian society. So unless we use those methods, which I don't think we will, suppression is our only option. That's a combination of shutdowns and social distancing in order to overwhelm hospitals. Because if you overwhelm hospitals, like you see in Italy and New York City, death rates shoot up by 10. So an order of magnitude. All the people who would be hospitalized would otherwise just die. So that is going up from 0.5 to 10 to 1% to 5 to 10%. That's pretty terrible. Italy, it was actually 11 something percent, just because those got so bad. So suppression is super costly, but it's the only approach that's effective. We know that a number of countries have actually succeeded in controlling their COVID-19 outbreaks. US is not there yet. It has not yet controlled it. We still have COVID-19 cases shooting up. But countries like Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, in the Western world, Germany have been really successful through aggressive suppression. But what happens when they let loose the restrictions on the suppression, then you have a blow up of cases. You have another spike of cases. So then the government has to reimpose restrictions in order to not overwhelm the hospitals and not have the death rate shoot up by an order of magnitude from 0.5 to 1% to 5 to 10%. So that's what we're facing. Our future until this widespread vaccination will be a combination of looser restrictions, increases in cases, then tighter restrictions, decreases in cases, and back around we go in these waves and waves and waves. That's what we're facing until the social distancing shutdowns, until vaccine is available by, hopefully it will be available by early 2022, very unlikely, more realistically by 2024, if unlucky then by 2025. Well, by 2027. So this is not a short-term emergency. This is a major disruption. It's not something that we are prepared for. And even in the most optimistic scenario, we will not be ready with the vaccine until 2022. That's what you got to be prepared for. And you need to understand that the world will be changed forever as a result of this. It will be changed forever. We'll change our habits, our norms, our values, our expectations, everything around us. We'll never go back to January 2020. And you have to prepare for this. And you have to prepare the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor for this. You need to empower those leaders to realize the extent of this major disruption. Most are way too optimistic right now. Looking at their responses, they're way too optimistic. They're still following kind of the Elon Musk, Goldman Sachs mentality. They're a number of weeks behind the times. You need to help them prepare for this uncomfortable reality. And by doing so, you'll not only help them accomplish their leadership goals, super important, but you'll build up your role as a trusted and credible advisor. So that builds you up and that builds them up. And that's what you need to do in order to ensure a good future for them. So don't plan for the optimistic scenario. Too many companies, they act as though the problem will blow over soon, it'll disappear by the summer or something like that. It won't. We have extensive evidence showing that though the virus spreads a little bit more slowly in warmer weather, it still spreads. And there are a number of warmer areas where it's spreading, like Australia and so on. Hope is not a strategy, so don't rely on hope. Don't hope for the most optimistic scenario. It's a good quote from Vince Lombardi. It's very applicable to this situation. Prepare for the moderate or pessimistic scenario instead. That's what you have to do. That's what you have to focus on. And the pandemic is a slow-moving threat. And here we go into the decision-making, as Jeff said. So we, as human beings, make very poor decisions about slow-moving threats that are unusual, slow-moving, because of how our brain is wired. We're not wired to deal with these threats. Our gut reaction, our intuition. So people go with their gut, do what's comfortable, trust your intuitions, be primal, be savage. That does not work very often. Very often, like in the case of the pandemic, that's a bad reaction. And it leads to decisions that undermine, endanger our businesses and our careers and our roles as trusted advisors if we fall into these traps. So, a little bit about me so you know where I'm coming from. Jeff had talked a little bit about me, but let me go through my experience, clients, media, and books briefly. Experience. So I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, small boutique consulting, coaching, and training company. We have 20 years of helping clients in disaster avoidance, decision-making, risk management, strategic planning, all of these things. I also spent 15 years in academia, publishing in a whole bunch of peer-reviewed venues like Behavior and Social Issues, Journal of Social and Political Psychology. So I have both the credibility from the academic side of things, neuroscience, behavioral economics, and real-life consulting, coaching, training in these areas. Now, clients for this real-life stuff. I work a lot with larger divisions of business companies as well as entrepreneurial startups. So worked with companies from Aflac to Xerox. So if you know Zappos, give me a call. It'll be nice to get it on there. Media. I've appeared in a whole bunch of media. Inc., Fast Company, Scientific American, CBS News, Time, CNBC, NPR, Newsweek. Recently appeared, of course, Jeff mentioned on his podcast. So that's something that is just a part of my experience. Published in a whole bunch of best-selling books. Really well known for Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. Then that one is on business decision-making, leadership decision-making. The blind spots between us, how to overcome unconscious cognitive bias and build better relationships, is about personal and professional relationships. The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide, how to help people, including leaders, realize the truth of reality when it's uncomfortable. Very important topic. And finally, my publisher approached me very recently to very quickly write a book about COVID-19, not going to the bookstores, going directly to online retailers. It's supposed to be out by mid-May, and I'm writing it like crazy. It's called Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. So that's a little bit about me so you know where I'm coming from. Now, let's talk a little bit about brain science. Why is bad advice so common? Well, we are all vulnerable to dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. And again, that's due to our evolutionary background and the structure of our brain. So those are two different things. They're related, but they're distinct. Our evolutionary background has to do with how we have evolved and how our brain has evolved, and the structure of our brain has to do with how we process information. Both of those contribute to the cognitive biases, which are the dangerous judgment errors we make, systematic patterns of dangerous judgment errors. Specifically, with regard to the pandemic, the most dangerous thing is how we respond to threats. Now, in the savanna environment, it was very important and valuable for us to have a fight or flight response, which is a major response to threats from the gut reaction, our intuition. It was life-saving for those hunter and gatherers because the risks they faced were immediate, intense, in the moment. They faced saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of it as a saber-toothed tiger response, where you had to jump at 100 shadows in order to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. But in today's world, this saber-toothed tiger response is bad because we don't face the same risk. We face long-term risks, uncertain risks. The risks don't come from a saber-toothed tiger physical danger, but much more from notifications from our cell phones. That's the kind of risks we face, and we're not wired to deal with them effectively. There are specifically three cognitive biases I want to highlight here. The normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, and the hyperbolic discounting. These are the ones most relevant for the pandemic. First, normalcy bias. We assume that everything will keep going normally. That's our intuition. So we think the future will be like the past. Next couple of years will be like the past few years. So it feels very unreal, very unnatural, very unnormal, very unintuitive to accept that our world has been disrupted forever, because we just very much think that the past will inform the future in fundamental ways. So we underestimate the likelihood and the impact of major disasters, whether things like Hurricane Katrina in certain regions or major global disasters like the pandemic. We greatly underestimate these things. That's the first one. And of course, the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor underestimate these things, which is really important for you to understand. Planning fallacy. Now, we tend to be very confident about ourselves, and especially the leaders for whom we're trusted advisors tend to be very confident about their judgment, about their plans. And so they assume that the future that will go according to plan. They make a plan, the future will go according to it. And that leads us to not prepare for problems and risks that we don't anticipate. You might have heard the phrase, failing to plan is planning to fail. Bad phrase, it's a misleading phrase. Much more accurate is failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. Because people make a plan and they think everything will be fine. That's not how the world works, but they feel that that's how the world works. So we underestimate the needed resources to cope with the situation. Time, money, information, social capital. I mean, how come the airline companies, which made a huge budget, a huge killing for the last decade, have now need to be bailed out? Well, they gave back this money through buybacks for shareholders, didn't have a cash cushion, so they are in a lot of trouble. Whereas a number of smarter companies developed a cash cushion and now are able to be very effective in the marketplace at taking advantage of other companies that are kind of screwed. So you need to help your leaders address this, for whom you're a trusted advisor. Hyperbolic discounting. This is a really important one. We tend to be very short-term oriented. Our gut reactions at least are. Because in the savanna environment, you killed the mammoth, you couldn't freeze the meat, and you couldn't really invest in your professional development. What, are you going to become a better axe chipper? This is not something that we are intuitively prepared for, intuitively, to accept that the long-term future is really important. So we are very short-term oriented. This short-termism greatly hinders us in preparation for slow-moving train wrecks like the pandemic. So we greatly underestimate the importance of the long-term and take actions right now that harm our long-term interests a lot. So this is something you need to really address, help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor address. So those are the three things I want to talk about as cognitive biases. How can we overcome them? You need to go against your intuitions and help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor also go against their intuitions. Again, our intuitions evolved to help early humans survive. So for example, you've probably felt this in your personal experience where it's very intuitive when you see a box of dozen donuts to eat the box of dozen donuts because we are very much triggered by sugar. So when you start eating one donut, it causes you to eat more and more and more because sugar triggers us. In the savanna environment, it was really important for us to, when we came across a source of sugar, like honey, bananas, apples, to eat as much of it as possible. Otherwise, we wouldn't survive. So we're the descendants of those who had a very strong fight or flight response, and for those who had a very strong response to eating as much sugar as possible. That was great for them, but not good for us. So we are not wired for making good decisions about food, about sugar, about donuts. Instead of eating donuts, it would be much better for us to eat a bowl of fruit. You probably know that because of the research on this topic. Although there's still an obesity epidemic here in the US because a lot of people don't know that and they don't think this way. So hopefully you know that you do exercises, you take care of your diet. And physical fitness, this is the physical fitness I'm talking about. Mental fitness is just as important, and the vast majority of people don't take care of their mental fitness, which is learning about how their mind steers them toward making the wrong decisions. We already know that our gut reactions around food, around what we eat, steer us in the wrong directions. Our gut reactions around business decision making also steers us very much in the wrong directions unless we deliberately develop healthy habits like choosing fruit over choosing donuts. So that's kind of the basic principle that you have to understand that's influencing us powerfully. So how can you prepare? You need to help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor, and by the way, for your own business, make long-term changes to your plans. You need to think years, not weeks. It will be around for years. So that's what you got to be prepared for. So how can businesses prepare? How can you help those for whom you're a trusted advisor prepare? You need to help them make fundamental changes to their business model, and you might consider fundamental changes to your business model. So for example, I do a lot of speaking and training, and all of those have been canceled, almost all of those. Still have a couple of small group under 10 people engagements, which I'll be doing. But the vast majority of face-to-face engagements have been canceled. So right now I'm very much pivoting to doing virtual presentations, webinars, consulting and coaching virtually. And it's something that can work effectively because I'm making a major investment in it for the long term, understanding the kind of consequences of the pandemic. It'll be at least around for the next 2 years, more realistically 4 years. So preparing for a 4-year stretch, I can't just wait it out. I need to fundamentally change my business model. And so do the business leaders for whom you're helping, and perhaps you yourself as well. So focus on the future based on virtual interactions and make a commitment to virtual teams and offerings. I'm advising all of my consulting and coaching clients to end their office space lease. That will help give them a lot of money, free up a lot of money that they can spend on other things, especially in the context of the recession, huge recession that's coming right now. It is here already. So that helps them provide a buffer, and their employees helps them fund their employees working in virtual teams, which is the next section. You need to get your employees to work on virtual teams. And in order to do that, you need to manage 6 areas of problem, risk, challenge. Motivation, engagement, effective communication, resolving conflicts, cultivating trust, cybersecurity, and accountability. So those are the 6 areas that you want to be thinking about addressing as you're helping the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor move to virtual teams. Motivation, engagement, what's up with that? Well, you probably know that already, according to extensive studies, we have a crisis of motivation engagement here in the United States. Of all the people who are engaged, when you look at studies like Gallup and so on, only 34% of employees are engaged. They're creatively engaged, they take initiative, they problem solve in the workplace. The rest don't. They just clock in, they leave problems to their supervisors, bosses, they ignore them, they're ready to leave for a new opportunity if one opens up. And that's about 50-ish%. Then about 15% are unfortunately actively disengaged. They're hostile to the company, they're bad-mouthing it around. So this is a bad category. So this is what happened before the pandemic. Now with the pandemic, what happens first? Well, when you transition to working from home, you're first in emergency mode. Emergency mode is great for the first couple of weeks, couple of months at most, where people are rallying around the flag, rallying around the company, but it doesn't last. That's not what it lasts. You'll have a lack of motivation for employees because they're not near other employees. People are very strongly motivated by tribalism. So talked about the we were tribal. We lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people as hunters and gatherers in the ancient savannah, and we still have those instincts. So we are motivated, engaged, are emotionally by other people being around us and doing the same thing. When you work from home, you don't have that. Your dog is not providing you that sort of motivation, engagement to do your work. So you need to figure out how to address these problems, how to help your leaders, the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor, address these problems. You also need to help them address the stress of adjusting to personal life and household to the pandemic. There's a lot of personal stresses that are associated with the pandemic. Like you talked about, somebody talked about the challenge of getting TP and so on. This is just one of those areas. And of course, their household. Maybe they're taking care of older adults who are more vulnerable to the pandemic and they need to have some kind of social distancing with them. They may be taking care of older teens who moved back in their household and they are bothering them and having problems. And then, of course, younger kids who are crawling all over them because school is out. So even more sources of distractions. You need to help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor, of course, provide support and guidance for these employees. And of course, if you have employees on your own, I have 6 employees, so I'm providing them support and guidance as a leader of my own small business. And if you have employees of your own, you need to provide them that sort of support as well. So next, effective communication. Now, this is difficult already before the pandemic in office settings. And when your team moves from an office setting to a virtual setting, it creates a lot more problems, a lot of difficulties because people aren't used to it, they aren't prepared for it. The sudden nature of it is really difficult. So written communication can cause a lot of misunderstandings. And I know this, I've helped a number of teams transition from prior to the pandemic from in office settings to virtual settings. And what happens is that people shift the vast majority of their communication to things like Slack, Asana, Trello, Microsoft Teams, some email, and so on. And when you have only text, when you don't have body tone, body language, when you don't have the voice, you don't know exactly what is being said. When somebody says something like, I think Michael should take this project, or I think Michael should take this project, or somebody says, I think Michael should take this project. Each of those things means a very different thing when you say it. And the only variance is tone and body language. When you write it, it all means the same. So this is a difficulty that people aren't used to. And it's essential to train employees on this, how to actually effectively communicate in virtual settings. So that's effective communication. Next, resolving conflicts. You will have a lot more conflicts with employees because in face-to-face interactions, people are much more used to seeing and observing problems developing as they're coming up. You could see somebody has anxiety, worry on their face as you're talking, or maybe body language, and then you're able to ask them in the office, what's up, what's going on, let's talk about this. You can nip a lot of problems in the bud, or if it's an ongoing problem, you can help resolve it, manage it somehow. When face-to-face interactions, you don't have that in virtual settings. This is a big problem, and this is something that you need to address, because in the virtual team, it's easier for problems to go unnoticed, and then it's harder to solve them. So it's critically important to train employees on noticing and addressing problems and conflicts. So next, cultivating trust. This is a big one, and it's a surprising big one. A lot of people don't think about how trust is cultivated in face-to-face environments. It just happens naturally. You meet over the water cooler, chat about your kids, about what's going on, about the local sports ball team and how you hate the other sports ball team here in Columbus, Ohio. Go Bucks, right? So this is what people are cheering about. This is what they're passionate about. And you humanize each other. You create that sense of connection. But you don't have that in virtual teams. That doesn't happen naturally. So you have to create a venue for it. This is not about training. So previous two were about training. This is not about training. This is a matter of creating a virtual venue that provides a context for this activity. Relationship building. Then cybersecurity. So this is something that might seem simple, but a lot of people aren't taking care of this. There's a reason for it. FBI has reported there is extensive increase in the cyber hacking because those working from home are much more vulnerable to cyber attacks. Their computers aren't hardened, their software isn't hardened, and they are not used to following cybersecurity protocols at home. So that is a problem for a lot of companies. You need to improve cybersecurity by providing training and funding for employees. And of course, as a trusted advisor to leaders, you need to help them do so. Finally, accountability. This is internal business model. Office environments allow many natural ways for people to be held accountable. If you're a leader, you can walk around the office, check in with people, see if someone seems like they're slacking off, they're not doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. And as a peer, you can pop into somebody's office and say, hey, Mary, where's that report that you were going to get for me yesterday? That is pretty hard to ignore, somebody standing in front of you. Emails are much easier to ignore, and Trello notifications are much easier to ignore. So new structure must be created to enable this accountability. Chain of command accountability, so this hierarchical accountability, and this peer-to-peer accountability. And there's a lot of instruments to do that. I can talk about that in the Q&A. So this is the 6 areas of the internal business model. There are also 6 areas for the external business model that you need to transform for the clients for whom you're a trusted advisor. Service delivery, relationships, manage disruptions, shifting norms, unknown unknowns, and then outcompeting your competition. So starting with service delivery. You need to transition to virtual service delivery, help them transition to doing so. Socially distanced if virtual can be done, but virtual can be done much more than you might think it can. Some will find it easier than others. So for me, switching from speaking and training face-to-face to doing virtual speaking and training, I mean, speaking is fine, webinar style. Training is more difficult, but I know I've done already virtual trainings for a while, day-long sessions. It's not as engaging as face-to-face, but it can be done. So that's much easier for me. For other people, it's more difficult, but you certainly can do it being creative. Help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor be creative in doing so. Some businesses, the best choice might be to close. We can talk about that in the Q&A, what that means for the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor. So for example, I helped one of my coaching clients transition from being the COO of a grocery, of a mid-sized restaurant chain in the Midwest, 24 diners, transition from being the COO of that, Chief Operating Officer, to leaving that sector because it's not a good sector to be in. So we decided on a new path, and she became the regional manager of a series of grocery stores, which were, of course, much better sector to be in, and they're expanding and hiring. So she got a good place there early on. And of course, it's related to her business, to her expertise. Relationships. Let's talk about relationships. You need to be able to establish new relationships and cultivate existing ones in virtual settings. This is something that you need to do with external stakeholders, and the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor need to do that. Their sales teams, their marketing teams, and so on. This is a skill you need to train. Clients, service providers, political leaders. So important right now with this government stimulus. Prospects, investors, suppliers, and so on. You need to invest in professional development to do so for yourself and, of course, for the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor. Next, managing disruptions. This is an area that people often don't think about, but a lot of people with whom you collaborate, of course, they will be in a disrupted state. So I'm having some troubles with my accounts receivable, for example. So external stakeholders, most will not plan for the long-term disruption of the pandemic. You're being savvy as a result of the C-suite network access. You are able to get this information about the long-term impact of the pandemic. And it's great that you're checking this out and getting this information. But many people are not, and they will not be prepared for this. So you need to make a plan for protecting yourself from their failures and protecting the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor from the failures of those for whom external stakeholders will fail. Next, shifting norms. Think about how norms will shift over the next 4 years as we're dealing in the moderate scenario with the pandemic. Think about that. Think about these shifting norms. After several years of restrictions and loosenings of various sorts, these waves, people will, as I mentioned, will have very different norms, values, behaviors, desires, expectations, and you got to get ahead of that. Get ahead of the curve. What do you think they will want that's relevant to your business and, of course, to the businesses of the clients for whom you're a trusted advisor? Anticipate and get ahead of these shifts. Next, unknown unknowns. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know, and we can talk about in the Q&A about what are the unknowns associated with the pandemic. This pandemic was a predictable disaster, but many people just didn't think about it. A lot of people like Bill Gates were on the front lines of saying, hey, we're really vulnerable to pandemic. It will come sooner rather than later. So clearly a number of people predicted it. And a lot of others like Elon Musk and Goldman Sachs, ignored it as a situation, even though it was clear. So you need to scan your environment for potential major disasters, be realistic about it. Ones directly caused by COVID-19, there are a number, we can talk about that, and ones that aren't directly caused by it, but are exacerbated by it. Protect against them Of course, not everything can be predicted. So leave yourself a larger cash cushion than you anticipate needing and help your the clients for whom you're a trusted advisor, leave a larger cash cushion. So Berkshire Hathaway under Warren Buffett is very notable for this, did a really smart job and left a huge cash cushion of over 100 billion to protect against what they clearly saw would be a serious situation coming down the line. Now they're in a great situation to buy up troubled companies. So you want to help your client be in that situation. Finally, outcompete your competition. So this is a really important one. Your clients are in a competitive marketplace, and of course you are as well. So you want to understand that the steps that I talked about will help your clients and you get a major competitive advantage in this marketplace. And this is great because there are so many who will fail to adapt to the pandemic. They will stumble, they will fall, some will go bankrupt, some will be hurt in other ways. They will not be in a good position to retain their clients and retain great employees. So this is an opportunity for you to get ahead of these stumbling competitors. Seize market share, hire away good employees. This is what I'm talking about. Think about that long term, get ahead of these shifts, and this is an example of this shift. So you want to be thinking about preparing for that long-term future, for the moderate future. Don't go for the optimistic one, and perhaps the pessimistic one, you want to be ready for it to be pessimistic. Think about what kind of information would lead you to believe that you are in any of these futures, and then shift your resources and plans accordingly. So additional resources on this, if you want to check them out, tinyurl.com/de-event. There's a free coaching session with me. Happy to talk this through, happy to help you adapt it to your business, and 2 chapters from my forthcoming book, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. And now I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, everybody, let's jump in with questions. If you want, just raise your hand. But the first question, though, I got to tell you, Gleb, that jumped off was, what software are you using for the presentation?
Oh, it's called Prezi. So Prezi Video. Yep, Prezi invited me as one of the thought leaders who was developing really good content around the pandemic to participate in their early testing program. So they gave me the software for free to do webinars, presentations.
That's awesome. That's a great package. Yeah, Bob Pizzini first.
Hey, great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
2 questions. One is for your business model. You may have stated this, but are you positioning your business model for the 70% probability, the moderate probability?
I'm positioning it for between the moderate and the pessimistic. I'm anticipating 2025, so that I tend to be too optimistic. So I tend to, I want to be, that's one of my biggest cognitive biases is excessive optimism. So I don't want to be too optimistic about this. So I'm making my 5-year plan right now, or no, that's not true. I'm revising my 5-year plan. I mean, of course I had one. So I'm revising my 5-year plan right now with my business partner to aim for early 2025 as the time that we have a vaccine. And of course I can revise it, change the plans around if I have information that it's going to be later or earlier. So for example, recently, I think about 3 days ago, there was a new study that came out showing that the COVID-19 has more strains than we thought. Types of mutations. So there are 30 strains, and some of them are more deadly, some of them are less deadly. That indicates it will be harder to create a vaccine than we thought, because there's not like only a couple of strains. So you need to create a vaccine against a number of strains. So it's likely that the vaccines that are already in development will not address even half the strains. That means that they will unlikely to be effective. So that's an example of information that indicates to me that, yeah, we're not going to get there by early 2022.
Okay, I'm going to fire off 2 more questions real quick. One is, are your books available in audio format?
The Never Go With Your Gut, my primary one on business leadership, is available in audio format. I'll try to make the Resilience available in audio format.
Okay,
and
we know somebody that can do that for you if you need it. So
excellent, thank you.
And then last question, real quick: have you considered any military implications in all of your discussion and research?
Well, of course. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the U.S. military, a number of ships are getting hurt by and getting out of commission because of COVID-19. So you will definitely see some weakening of the US Navy and its imperial presence. I'm not saying imperial in a bad way, I'm saying in a good way around the world. That's going to be one dynamic, that a number of the US will be less able to extend its military reach. That means that there will be more global instability because the US is a peacekeeper, one of the major world peacekeepers. So there will be more global instability. That's one. Second, in areas that already see global instability, I mean, you already see civil unrest rising in a number of African nations, India, a number of other countries that are having more civil unrest. So if your supply chains or the supply chains of your clients, to the extent that they depend on production and distribution from areas that are less stable, those areas will be even less stable. And there might be various forms of civil unrest, military conflict, of course, as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Who else? Anybody else want to make sure? Yeah, Kathleen.
Dr. Gleb, you are a force of nature. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, yes. And I hope that's okay, the informality here. Two questions for you. Number one, how are you monetizing your knowledge and your expertise on this COVID-19 situation? How are you monetizing it for your business?
So, of course, I'm doing webinars. This one I'm doing for free, of course, but a whole bunch of other webinars I'm doing paid. That's easy. Then I'm getting coaching and consulting from those webinars. Well, for some from the articles, but mainly the articles are leading to webinars. So that after a webinar, I'm getting consulting and coaching inquiries about, hey, you gave a great webinar. Now, how do I adapt it to my business? Come in and help me do this. So and then help me make a strategic plan on the long term. So that's the main way that I'm monetizing this. Of course, the book and so on, but the book will be, I mean, it will sell, it will be some money, but it's mainly a way of sharing the information and getting more potential clients.
Yes, great.
Name of the game, and that's what this whole group works on all the time. So it's a very similar group. Kelly Richards, you had a question, and then I'll go to Bob. You're on mute, Kelly. Thank you.
Apologies there. Hi, Gleb. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been invaluable information. I have two questions to ask, if I might. One is whether you have been approached or are approaching yourself to be in need at the federal or state level to provide these insights, because I think you should be an advisor on this.
I really appreciate that. I have difficulties with being patient with some of the lack of competence shown by government officials. And that's one of the reasons I much prefer to work with business leaders who are much more decisive and much more, they have much more of their bottom line. They know where their bottom line is. And they know that, you know, if I translate this into simple monetary terms, then we can have a very clear and simple conversation. Whereas if I go into politics, it depends on public opinion versus what's best for public health and what's best for the financial situation. And that makes me very frustrated because I really, no, sorry, no, you can hear me.
I understand that. We in California is where I am. We have, the governor is doing a yeoman's job of having put together an economic recovery council of the surviving governors in California and a whole slew of business leaders. Mm-hmm. And he's measuring all his decisions based on science and hard data. So I encourage you to think about California, because we're kind of trying to make a leadership stance for the country.
If you have any connections and if the government indeed is looking at the science very strongly, please.
I do indeed. It's being co-chaired by Tom Steyer and Gavin Newsom, and I'd be happy to try to get you connected offline.
Perfect. Yeah, and you have the website tinyurl.com/the event, and we can put that in, and we'll talk offline.
Indeed.
Yeah,
indeed.
Kelly, I don't know if you have it, but I certainly do. Gavin's a friend of mine as well. I will send a link to this recording to Gavin's private email address.
Brilliant, Jeff.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I'll be happy. Yep, if a governor is indeed looking at the science, I'll be happy to.
He's a smart guy. He listens to a lot of different things, and this will be a private back channel, so I can just say, hey, this is something, Gavin, you should listen to. And he's that kind of guy.
That's perfect. That's what I was thinking too, Jeff. And my second question, if I might, Gleb, is to do with the recovery. Again, I hate to say it, my intuition, informed by data, best we can get it, is that we're going to have a W-style recovery. But, you know, this whole balance of health recovery in tandem with economic recovery. And my gut says, to your point about a couple of years before we have a perfect vaccine, that's probably true. But to the extent, you know, even like the flu, we don't have, as you said, we don't have a perfect vaccine, but people still get the flu shot every year, and a certain percentage are better, and we keep going. I've heard rumors that, again, maybe overly optimistic, we could have that first vaccine that might help a certain percentage of the population as soon as this year's flu shot, maybe November, December timeframe. Very aggressive, I realize. Do you put any stock in that kind of a W cycle until we do get to that perfect vaccine a couple of years out?
What I've seen is that the most optimistic scenarios in vaccine development are not going to have any mass vaccination until the summer of 2021, and that's the start of mass vaccination. Now, what we can have before that is people at super high risk. So, for example, first responders, healthcare workers who are in the hospital and who don't have enough protective PPE, and it's more dangerous. It might be more dangerous for them to not have a vaccine than have a vaccine. So for those people to have, and who are actually healthcare experts and they know the dangers of this versus, you know, Joe on the street who doesn't understand the dangers of this, realistically speaking, to have a vaccine. So that would be, you know, something in the couple of 100,000 category. And now those would be sort of guinea pigs for the rest of us. That is not a mass vaccination program. That won't allow people to go back to work, unfortunately. So we'll have waves of restrictions and loosenings until we have a mass vaccination, which at the best case scenario can start taking place by summer 2021, and then would be half of the people, approximately the vulnerable categories, would be vaccinated by early 2022. That's the best case scenario that we realistically can have.
Understood. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want to jump in because, you know, I'm the chairman, so I get to do it. So let me ask a question. Then we'll go to Bob and then we'll go to Arjun. We're watching, I think there's going to be two kinds of people here, and you tell me how, and you know the neuroscience of this, so help me understand because I'm not that smart, but there's going to be one group of people that's ready to go around turning anyone in that walks within 3 feet of someone else. They're going to want to take a picture. And basically New York's actually encouraging this. And then there's this other side that are saying, forget the week, let's go back to work, right? And they're saying we can I actually saw a sign on the news that said, sacrifice the week. Let's get back to work. I mean, I actually saw that. So, and there's that whole side of like, I don't give a shit. We're going back. We got to go do this. I mean, you see that. Tell me about how we deal with that. I mean, how do we walk that tightrope between those two? Or do we? How do we speak to it? And then, because you got one state, Georgia's opening up right now. In South Dakota, where I'm living, we won't even see the peak of this thing until mid-June.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
It's really tough. I saw a really interesting study which came out a couple of days ago, which talked about how people who listen to others, you know, respond to the virus. So the study looked at Fox News, specifically two talk show hosts, Tucker Carlson, who was better than average Fox News host in terms of conveying information about this early, and Sean Hannity, who was worse than average Fox News host. So just conveying the information. Not saying about Fox News is bad or good, I'm just talking about those two show hosts, to be clear. Tucker Carlson early on said, this is going to be serious, you really need to take care of yourself. Sean Hannity was dismissing it, saying it's not a problem. They looked at the viewership of those two shows, and they saw that compared to the average Fox News viewer, the viewers who were viewing Tucker Carlson had 3% less infection and deaths. And those who were listening and viewing Sean Hannity had 5% more infections and deaths. So that's just kind of the difference, purely difference of viewership of two shows, which were otherwise pretty ideologically similar. Tucker Carlson.
I hate to see Rush Limbaugh's listenership.
I have no idea. So that was just the study that came out, and I'm only looking at studies. So you'll see that people who are, you know, just ignoring things, going back to work, they'll be dying at a higher death rate, and they'll be, you know, killing grandma at a higher death rate. So, you know, and this is something that's very tragic for me, that, you know, my dad is in pretty bad shape, but, you know, they will be killing loved ones. The firefighter's daughter that I mentioned, the fire kind of couple, firefighter, the guy's a firefighter, the woman is a police officer. Their child, the 5-year-old kid died. It's in the news recently. And it's most likely that one of them gave it to her because they're first responders. They can't not be in the front lines, right? So this is a pretty terrible situation. And these are the people who go around and say, whatever, let's go back to work, let's do everything, who will get others killed and who will get themselves killed and who will get members of their family killed. So this is the kind of people that you want to be careful about and you want to avoid, and you want to not spend too much time with them because they might be carriers without realizing it. They are putting you at risk. So you need to be figuring out how to deal with these people because you, of course, need to interact with them. So this is something for you to figure out how to protect yourself. This is one of those when I talked about external stakeholders who are not addressing COVID-19 as nearly as seriously as it deserves to be, that's part of it. And this is something that you need to figure out how to deal with these folks. It's a hard thing to deal with.
Absolutely. Hey, Bob.
Yes, thank you very much, Gleb. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. First of all, I hope your father is doing well and he's going to recover.
I really hope so.
No, thank you very much. 2 questions. 1, leaders, when you talk to business leaders, it's this hunker down, save cash mentality. When we go talk to them, when I go talk to them and say, look, you need to reinvent your business. They're like, no, I just need to cut costs, need to cut costs. And so how do you deal with that mentality, right? How do you deal with this mentality of fundamentally, you've got to reinvent your business? It's gone, it's dead, right? So that's the first thing. Instead of saying, I need to focus on cost control. Yes, you need to do that, but allocating money to reinvent your business. So that's the first question. The second one is more of financial markets. I mean, the stock market's up, right? I mean, it's down, but the stock market does not seem to reflect the reality of this pandemic. And so those are the 2 big questions about mentality of business leaders. How do you change those mentality to fundamentally transform in the stock market? Please, thank you.
Sure. So the stock market, unfortunately, is still focusing on the kind of input that Goldman Sachs gave, which is way too optimistic. So that's the stock market is simply, and Elon Musk, how he moves markets. Goldman Sachs moves markets, and they're moving markets in the wrong direction. The stock market is being way too optimistic about this. I think that the $50 billion for airlines will not be enough to tide them over in this period. You do not want to be holding an airline stock right now. A lot of people are buying airlines because they're like, government won't let them go bankrupt. They're getting 50 billion. Well, I mean, 4 years of losing so much money, there'll be mergers, there'll be cuts. The stock market is being way too optimistic. Right now, I am shorting the stock market. So just FYI, that's just my personal perspective. Shorting the stock market, investing into stay-at-home stocks, Zoom, and so on. So that's stock market. Now, for business leaders, how I approach this question, and you're right, and a number of my clients are in that position, is that I guide them into cutting those areas that are going to be beneficial for them in the long term anyway. So I say, hey, totally right, totally understand your need to cut. What about giving up your office space right now? Selling it if you own it, most don't. Leasing it out. Having, if you need to have a conference, if you need to have a meeting, you can always use co-working spaces. How much does that save? I mean, that saves, for smaller companies, that saves 10,000 a month, right? Very small companies. For larger companies, it saves 100,000 a month. And of course, for really large companies, it saves $1 million a month. So that is an easy thing to cut. And then it forces them into the next steps, because then you cut that, and then you need to, of course, give support for your employees who are working at home. And so you need to fund some stuff, because if you don't support their cybersecurity, obviously it's going to cost you a lot of money. That's clear. That's crystal clear. And if you don't support their effective communication, they make mistakes, do professional development, that's crystal clear. So a lot of this stuff comes from making initial decisions that you help them make that lead to other decisions, healthy decisions, where initially you cut costs on things that they really shouldn't be spending money on, like office space. Cleaning office space, and I talk to them, if they still want to retain office space, I point out to them the liabilities, the legal liabilities they'll be facing, which a lot of my clients are going to be facing, where lawyers are hungry for business right now because a lot of their typical business dropped. And this is something that a lot of business leaders are not thinking about. They're thinking about, how do I get back to the office right now? And I'm telling them, do you really want to face the legal liabilities of this? No, you don't. So having that conversation, telling them, here are the areas you should be cutting, then leading from that into, hey, these are areas that are cut. Here are the areas that are going to cost you a lot of money if you don't invest into this. So that's the kind of conversation when a person is in defensive position. So this is kind of the part of the emotional intelligence where we're talking about cognitive biases. They're in defensive position. They're only ready to hear defensive information. So you give them defensive information that would defend them from threats, let them cut costs, and then lead them out later as they get less defensive into reinvention. But first address their defensive nature, their defensive impulses.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very helpful.
Arjun.
We really truly appreciate, because many a time we don't know what we don't know. This was like a huge enlightenment for us. So 2 follow-up questions. One is for all of us to at least look for the last 5 to 6 weeks to agree. We need to agree on common numbers. The very fact even simple numbers of ratios are being calculated based on denominator and numerator, both unknown. What are KPIs, numbers you're looking at to see whether it's going on optimistic or which direction? And secondly, based on the work, have you looked at what industries are going to thrive most? So that way, for most of us, we can start learning from you on where to go forward. Again, thank you really for everything you're sharing.
You're very welcome. So the KPIs, what you're going to be looking for, the main thing that's going to lead us out of this is going to be vaccine. You don't want to look for, triumphalist vaccine studies from the vaccine manufacturers saying, yay, our vaccine is approved. What it means that their vaccine is approved often means that the vaccine is approved for human trials. And human trials, most vaccines don't make it for human trials. So you want to be very careful about that. A good person to look at in terms of this information is experts who don't have a stake in which vaccine makes it through, but who are experts in vaccines. From a business perspective, Bill Gates is actually a really good voice on this. So if you want to follow someone who is really thinking about the economy and more broadly, he's someone who is a good voice on this. So the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, in a nonprofit way, they don't get any stakes. They're funding a lot of vaccines, again, giving them grants, pure grants, and they are very much interested in getting a vaccine out as quickly as possible. So he's saying, for example, he himself knows that 18 months is the earliest we can have for a realistic mass vaccination program. He's also saying, just like I am, that most vaccines will fail. So this is, stuff from him. You can, of course, look at the expert researchers who are talking about, hey, this is who don't have a stake in the game. This is when we expect vaccines to be available. Vaccines are the most important thing in this case, unfortunately. So that's kind of what I would talk about in terms of what kind of things you want to look at for seeing the timeline, because that's the only way that we're really going to get out of this. That's one. For industries, of course, tech is going to be pretty good, especially the techs that are dependent, that facilitate people staying at home. Everything from, if you've heard Amazon, Zoom, a lot of video conference companies that are going to be doing well right now. Companies that provide people with activities to do at home are going to do well. So gardening companies. Something that you might not be thinking about, but that you want to explore is that as right now, people are going to do a lot of gardening, right? But in the winter, people are going to want to do DIY projects in their homes. So things like Home Depot, things like these areas, things where people are provided with services and occupations that they can do at home, various entertainment options. So things that various streaming services. So a lot of technology stocks are going to do well. Financial stocks are going to do well. They're going to be hit early onward with a lot of companies going bankrupt, but overall they will make it out through this pretty well, partially because the government is funneling money through them and they're taking a cut of the money, regardless of whether they should or not. They are taking a cut of this money and they are going to do pretty well in part because of this. So finance, people are going to be thinking about in terms of insurance. Insurance companies are going to do well in this. So these are the kinds of companies that are going to do well in this. Direct-to-retailer companies, so manufacturing companies, branding companies that are direct-to-retailer are going to do well as well. So those are companies that are going to be pretty successful in this marketplace. You don't want to get involved, of course, healthcare companies. I mean, this is clear. After an initial period where elective surgeries are going to be not allowed, they'll lose some money, hospitals, but overall, healthcare is going to go up. People will be much more concerned about their health this is an undoubtable consequence of this pandemic. So people will be much more focused on their health than they have been. So exercise companies, everything from exercise to mental well-being to direct taking care of people, medtech companies, all of these companies are going to be doing well. Companies that aren't going to be doing well are real estate. So a lot of real estate companies are not going to be doing well. Agriculture will take a while to adapt to this new situation. So a lot of companies that you might think are going to do well are not going to be doing nearly as well. And a lot of companies, mining and so on, are not going to be doing as well, partially because when you have a breakout of COVID-19 in, let's say, the workers of a mine, then it's going to spread pretty quickly among them. And remember that about half the people who have COVID-19 are asymptomatic. So there'll be lots of shutdowns, lots of closures. So manufacturing companies are going to be in a difficult position. I say this, it's hard for me to say this because a lot of my clients are in the Midwest in Columbus, Ohio. So a lot of my company's clients are manufacturing, but they're going to have a hard time. They're struggling. So this is something that you want to be careful about, that sector. I hope that's helpful.
A very important part. James, you got a question?
Yeah, I've got a question, and thanks again. I mean, this is amazing.
You're welcome, James.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, my question is, you mentioned how we need to plan for the future, 4 or 5 year out plan.
Yes.
And you had mentioned also pivoting now.
Yes.
So in the pivoting now to adjust for the new abnormal versus pivoting or preparing for the 4 to 5 years from now, what's more important? How do you tie the two together? Do you expect it to be a completely different view after the recovery in 4 to 5 years? Is there a flow to tie them together, or should we be looking at a now versus later, or is it just changing now in a way that gets us to that?
Yes, so it's the last. So you want to paint a clear vision of the future. There are a variety. Look at the optimistic scenario, the moderate scenario, and the pessimistic scenario. What will your business look like in 5 years in the optimistic scenario? That means 2-year, early 2022 vaccine, then of course society will be changed, habits, norms. How will your business evolve over that 5 years? That's the optimistic scenario. Do the same thing for the moderate scenario. 5 years out, what will happen if a vaccine is available by early 2024? How will your business be impacted? What will be the dynamics, will be the transformation? Then the pessimistic scenario. If 2025 passes, it doesn't look like we're having a vaccine. So what does your business look like in that situation? All of those 3 situations. Look at what your business looks like, and then what kind of problems might arise in each of these situations for your business. Think about how you can solve these problems in advance right now, or how you can make a plan at least to address these problems. Invest resources into addressing these problems now. Think about what kind of opportunities might arise for your business, and of course for your clients, all of that stuff. This is information you're conveying to your clients, right? So think about what kind of opportunities might arise for them and for you, and how you can right now take advantage of these opportunities that might arise. Some of them you can create, some of them you can plan for, depending on the opportunity. And then think about what information would lead you to believe you're in each of these scenarios. I talked about the research on vaccines as being one of them. Be careful about spin conveyed by politicians about various things. As you can tell, I don't have a too high of regard for politicians. Gavin Newsom might be different, but you want to look at people who are actually doing the science, doing the research, or people who don't have a stake in the game, like Bill Gates. There are a number of other really prominent people who don't have a direct stake, Warren Buffett and so on, who are looking at the situation very closely and doing good analysis of the situation. So that's the kind of approach I would recommend you to take. So look at those scenarios, see what your business would look like, and how then plan for the moderate pessimistic scenario. I'm telling you, I'm playing for early 2025 vaccine available, and then what you would need to do to get there successfully. Your most ideal vision of the future at early 2025, all problems solved, all opportunities seized. What can you do right now to get there? So pivot your business right now to get to that point, and then adjust, execute, adjust as you get more information about vaccine and other relevant factors going forward. That would be my best advice for what you can do right now. But the doing right now means figuring out the plan first. Start from the end out and go toward the now. So start from the end and go toward the present.
Imagine one of the things you're probably going to see Trump do. I can tell you already what's going to happen. He's going to, right before the election, sometime in August, he's going to point back to this, and he's going to talk about the Chinese virus. He's already been throwing it out there, and he's testing it. That's what he does. He throws stuff out and says, does it stick? Does it stick? Does it stick? Well, with his base, it sticks. And one of the things he's going to do to use this piece of it is to say, we put all of our faith in China. We got 34% of our GDP over there. We got, 27% of our GDP, 17% worldwide. In some other countries, it's even higher. Why are we putting all those plants over there? We've screwed ourselves. We don't want to be reluctant. We don't want to depend on this Chinese virus, Chinese supplies, Look what they did to our country. We need to bring it back to America. And so or to bring it closer to home. So he's going to do that as well. It's going to be interesting to see how the message is going to take off on this piece of it as well with the manufacturing. Mark, you got another question?
Yeah, I really appreciate this. This has really put a ton of flesh on some of the bones and some of the thoughts that I've had. Some of the things that I'm telling people is there isn't going to be a new normal. There's going to be a series of ever-changing new normal, which means that instead of making a plan, you need to build a competence for adjustment. Mm-hmm. Because that's going to be the distinguishing characteristics and your competitive advantage is your ability to see, to listen to your clients, figure out how your value has changed, because everybody's value has changed and is going to continue to change. And it's either your value has changed or how you deliver it has got to change in some combination. So, man, do I appreciate your putting a ton of flesh on those bones.
You're very welcome, Mark. I'm glad that this was helpful. And definitely you want to give people confidence about their competence and ability to be resilient in this situation. This is incredibly important. At the same time, you want to encourage them to make plans for a variety of scenarios. So what can happen in this scenario, this scenario, this scenario, and how can you go forward with that? So that a combination of resilience, adaptability, and vision of potential futures.
Okay, Tina, one more, because we've already held them longer than we expected.
I have a burning question. When can I see my grandson?
That's a great question. I mean, depending on the situation, is your grandson near you?
No, he's in Denver and I'm in San Francisco.
Oh, I would say not for the next 3 months. I mean, you can see him on Zoom, but not for the next 3 months. This is not something you want to mess around with flights if you can help it. So
it's it's interesting how it's changing the family dynamics too. Quite frankly, there's some positives without question. Think about this. One of the greatest positives I'm seeing is actually families are getting together and doing game nights, even virtually.
Yep.
They're having more group calls. My family's never had a group call. We're now doing them every single week and with different family groups. And, it could be good or bad, depending on what you think about that. But let's just assume it's a good thing, right? So you're actually seeing some different things. It also is causing us, I just give you my own personal thing. As many of you know, Todd, you might see Todd walk in here. Todd's got cognitive disabilities, which he operates, he's 2 years younger than I am, but he operates at like a 12-year-old. But we've had huge difficulties with him because he's autistic. So he has his own routine, the way he does it. And so we've had to break that routine and he wants to just go home. Well, he's also got poor functioning kidneys. If he gets this thing, he's dead. He's absolutely dead. And so we're having to battle with that and battle him and to understand what is this and why. So I will tell you, for the first week, he hated me because first thing I did was, Tammy, you got to go pick up Todd. You got to bring him home. You have to bring him home right now because this is going to be that bad. We have to go get him. We have to bring him home. We have to keep him away from everybody. So, but he thought I was trying to restrict him. So he's hated me because I'm the one to blame because he can't go anywhere. Right. But it's a whole different kind of thing that you have to weigh into the situation. And by the way, we've had to tell him he wants to go see another relative. Well, if you go, you're never coming back here for the next 4 months. You're not coming back because you can't go out and then expose yourself and then come back. I can't have you ping-ponging because, as most of us know, the business really depends on all of us everyone in this entire square. We go down, the business goes down. And so, even to the point where I'm having to deal with feelings, guess who goes out and has to get the groceries and things like that? Tammy does, not me. And of course I would be the one, first of all, I have to go do that. But for God's sakes, we're trying to protect me because the bread, the bread and butter, the eye candy that we all have, it's a tough thing to deal with some days, right? So just a point that we have to think through sometimes.
That's a good point. That's a very important point, and you have to protect yourself in this situation. You know, if you can, obviously get grocery delivery and so on. Yes, you have to protect yourself and not let your members of your household go out if you can absolutely help it. So this is
and Dr. Gleb, I want to thank you again for everything today. What a great presentation.